Chapter 81, Part 8 of The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Volume 2, by Tobias Smollett. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. The Memoirs of a Lady of Quality, Part 8. On my last arrival at Paris, I was surrounded by a crowd of professed admirers who sighed and flattered in the usual forms. But, besides that my heart was not in a condition to contract new engagements, I was prepossessed against them all, by supposing that they presumed upon the knowledge of my indiscretion with S., and therefore rejected their addresses with detestation and disdain. For, as I have already observed, I was not to be won but by the appearance of esteem, and the most respectful carriage, and though by a false step I had in my own opinion forfeited my title to the one, I was resolved to discourage the advances of any man who seemed deficient in the other. In this manner my lovers were one by one repulsed, almost as soon as they presented themselves, and I preserved the independence of my heart until I became acquainted with a certain peer, whom I often saw at the house of Mrs. P., an English lady then resident at Paris. This young nobleman professed himself deeply enamoured of me in a style so different than that of my other admirers, that I heard his protestations without disgust, and though my inclinations were still free, could not find in my heart to discountenance his addresses, which were preferred with the most engaging modesty, disinterestedness, and respect. By these never-failing arts he gradually conquered my indifference, and gained the preference of my esteem from Lord C. and the Prince of C., who were at that time his rivals. But what contributed more than any consideration to his success was his declaring openly that he would marry me without hesitation as soon as I could obtain a divorce from my present husband, which in all probability might have been easily procured, for, before I left England, Lord had offered me £5,000 if I would consent to such a mutual release, that he might be at liberty to espouse one Miss W. of Kent, to whom he then made love upon honourable terms. But I was fool enough to refuse his proposal by the advice of S., and whether or not his lordship, finding it impracticable to wed his new mistress, began to make love upon another footing, I know not. But certain it is, the mother forbade him the house, a circumstance which he took so heinously ill, that he appealed to the world in a public advertisement, beginning with, "Whereas for some time I have passionately loved Miss W., and upon my not complying with the mother's proposals they have turned me out of doors. This is to justify," etc. This declaration, signed with his name, was actually printed in a number of detached advertisements, which he ordered to be distributed to the public; and afterwards, being convinced by some of his friends that he had done a very silly thing, he recalled them at half a guinea apiece. A copy of one of them was sent to me at Paris, and I believe my father now has one of the originals in his possession. After this wise vindication of his conduct, he made an attempt to carry off the lady from church by force of arms, but she was rescued by the neighbours, headed by her brother, who, being an attorney, had like to have made his lordship smart severely for this exploit. Meanwhile my new admirer had made some progress in my heart, and, my finances being exhausted, I was reduced to the alternative of returning to Lord again, or accepting Earl B.'s love. When my affairs were brought to an issue, I made no hesitation in my choice, putting myself under the protection of a man of honour whom I esteemed, rather than suffer every sort of mortification from a person who was the object of my abhorrence and contempt. From a mistaken pride, I chose to live in Lord B.'s house, rather than be maintained at his expense in another place. We spent several months agreeably in balls and other diversions, visited Lord B., who lived at a distance of a few leagues from Paris, and stayed some days at his house, where the entertainment was, in all respects, delightful, elegant, and refined. Their habitation was the rendezvous of the best company in France, and Lady B maintained the same superiority in her own sex for which her lord is so justly distinguished among the men. About Christmas we set out for England, accompanied by a little North Briton who lived with Lord B as his companion, and did not at all approve of our correspondence. Whether out of real friendship for his patron, or apprehension that in time I might supersede his own influence with my lord, I shall not pretend to determine. Be that as it will, the frost was so severe that we were detained 10 days at Calais before we could get out of the harbour, and during that time I reflected seriously on what my new lover proposed. As he was very young and unacquainted with the world, I thought my story might have escaped him, and therefore determined to give him a faithful detail of the whole, that he might not have anything to reproach me with in the sequel. Besides, I did not think it honest to engage him to do more for me than he might afterwards perhaps think I was worth. Accordingly, I communicated to him every particular of my life, and the narration, far from altering his sentiments, rather confirmed his good opinion by exhibiting an undoubted proof of my frankness and sincerity. In short, he behaved with such generosity as made an absolute conquest of my heart. But my love was of a different kind from that which had formerly reigned within my breast, being founded upon the warmest gratitude and esteem, exclusive of any other consideration, though his person was very agreeable, and his address engaging. When we arrived in England, I went directly to his country seat, about 12 miles from London, where he soon joined me, and we lived some time in perfect retirement. His relations being greatly alarmed with the apprehension that Lord would bring an action against him, though he himself desired nothing more, and lived so easy under that expectation, that they soon laid aside their fears on his account. We were visited by Mr. H. B., a relation of my lord, and one Mr. R., of the Guards, who, with a little Scotchman and my lover, made an agreeable set, among whom I enjoyed hunting and all manner of country diversions. As to Mr. H. B., if ever there was a perfection in one man, it centred in him, or, at least he, of all the other men I ever knew, approached the nearest to that idea which I had conceived of a perfect character. He was both good and great, possessed an uncommon genius, and the best of hearts. Mr. R. was a very sociable man, had a good person, and cultivated understanding, and my lord was excessively good-humoured, so that with such companions no place could be dull or insipid. For my own part, I conducted the family, and, as I endeavoured to please and make everybody happy, I had the good fortune to succeed. Mr. B. told me that before he saw me he heard I was a fool, but finding, as he was pleased to say, that I had been egregiously misrepresented, he courted my friendship, and a correspondence commenced between us. Indeed, it was impossible for any person to know him without entertaining the utmost esteem and veneration for his virtue. After I had lived some time in this agreeable retreat, my husband began to make a bustle. He sent a message demanding me from Lord B., then came in person, with his nightcap in his pocket, intending to have stayed all night had he been asked, and attended by a relation, whom he assured that I was very fond of him, and detained by force from his arms. Finding himself disappointed in his expectations, he commenced a lawsuit against Lord B., though not for a divorce, as we desired, but with a view to reclaim me as his lawful wife. His lawyers, however, attempted to prove criminal conversation, in hopes of extorting money from my lover. But their endeavours were altogether fruitless, for no servant of Lord B.'s or mine could with justice say we were ever seen to trespass against modesty and decorum, so that the plaintiff was nonsuited. While this cause was pending, all my lover's friends expressed fear and concern for the issue, while he himself behaved with the utmost resolution, and gave me such convincing proofs of a strong and steady affection, has augmented my gratitude and riveted the ties of my love, which was unblemished, faithful, and sincere." Soon after this event, I was seized with a violent fit of illness, in which I was visited by my father, and attended by 2 physicians, one of whom despaired of my life, and took his leave accordingly. But Dr. S., who was the other, persisted in his attendance, and in all human appearance saved my life, a circumstance by which he acquired a great share of reputation. Yet, notwithstanding all his assistance, I was confined to my bed for 10 weeks, during which Lord B.'s grief was immoderate, his care and generosity unlimited. While I lay in this extremity, Mr. S., penetrated by my melancholy condition, which revived his tenderness, begged leave to be admitted to my presence, and Lord B. would have complied with his request, had I not been judged too weak to bear the shock of such an interview. My constitution, however, agreeably disappointed my fears, and the fever had no sooner left me than I was removed to a hunting seat belonging to my lover, from whence, after I had recovered my strength, we went to B. Castle, where we kept open house. And while we remained at this place, Lord B. received a letter from Lord dated in November, challenging him to single combat in May upon the frontiers of France and Flanders. This defiance was sent in consequence of what had passed between them long before my indisposition, at a meeting in a certain tavern, where they quarrelled, and in the fray my lover threw his antagonist under the table. I counselled him to take no notice of this rhodomontade, which I knew was void of all intention of performance, and he was wise enough to follow my advice, resolved, however, should the message be repeated, to take the challenger at his word. Having resided some time at this place, we returned to the other country house which he had left, where Lord B. addicted himself so much to hunting and other male diversions, that I began to think he neglected me, and apprised him of my suspicion, assuring him at the same time that I would leave him as soon as my opinion should be confirmed. This declaration had no effect upon his behaviour, which became so remarkably cold, that even Mr. R., who lived with us, imagined that his affection was palpably diminished. When I went to town, I was usually attended by his cousin, or this gentleman, or both, but seldom favoured with his company. Nay, when I repaired to Bath for the re-establishment of my health, he permitted me to go alone, so that I was quite persuaded of his indifference. And yet I was mistaken in my opinion. But I had been spoiled by the behaviour of my first husband and Mr. S., who never quitted me for the sake of any amusement, and often resisted the calls of the most urgent business rather than part from me, though but for a few hours. I thought every man who loved me truly would act in the same manner, and whether I am right or wrong in my conjectures, I leave wiser casuists to judge. Certain it is, such sacrifice and devotion is the most pleasing proof of an admirer's passion, and voyons plus souvent et ne me donner rien is one of my favourite maxims. A man may give money because he is profuse. He may be violently fond because he is of a sanguine constitution. But if he gives me his time, he gives me an unquestionable proof of my being in full possession of his heart. My appearance at Bath without the company of Lord B. occasioned a general surprise, and encouraged the men to pester me with addresses, every new admirer endeavouring to advance his suit by demonstrating the unkind and disrespectful behaviour of his lordship. Indeed, this was the most effectual string they could touch. My pride and resentment were alarmed. I was weak enough to listen to one man, who had like to have insinuated himself into my inclinations. He was tall and large-boned, with white hair, inclining to what is called sandy, and had the reputation of being handsome, though I think he scarce deserved that epithet. He possessed a large fortune, loved mischief, and stuck at nothing for the accomplishment of his designs, one of his chief pleasures being that of setting any two lovers at variance. He employed his address upon me with great assiduity, and knew so well how to manage my resentment that I was pleased with his manner, heard his vows without disgust, and, in a word, promised to deliberate with myself upon his proposals, and give him an account of my determination in writing. Thus resolved, I went to Lord B. in Wiltshire, whither I was followed by this pretender to my heart, who visited us on the footing of an acquaintance. But when I reflected on what I had done, I condemned my own conduct as indiscreet, though nothing decisive had passed between us, and began to hate him in proportion to the self-conviction I felt, perceiving that I had involved myself in a difficulty from which I should not be easily disengaged. For the present, however, I found means to postpone my declaration. He admitted my excuse, and I returned to London with Lord B., who was again summoned to the field by his former challenger. H.D.N., governor, counsellor, and steward to this little hero, came to Lord B. with a verbal message, importing that his lordship had changed his mind about going to Flanders, but expected to meet him, on such a day and hour, in the burying-ground near Red Lion Square. Lord B. accepted the challenge, and gave me an account of what had passed. But he had been anticipated by the messenger, who had already tried to alarm my fears from the consideration of the consequence, that I might take some measures to prevent their meeting. I perceived his drift, and told him plainly that Lord had no intention to risk his person, though he endeavoured with all his might to persuade me that his principal was desperate and determined. I knew my little husband too well to think he would bring matters to any dangerous issue, and was apprehensive of nothing but foul play from the villainy of H.D.N., with which I was equally well acquainted. Indeed, I signified my doubts on that score to Mr. B., who would have attended his kinsman to the field, had he not thought he might be liable to censure if anything should happen to Lord B., because he himself was heir at law. For that reason he judiciously declined being personally concerned, and we pitched upon the Earl of A., his lordship's uncle, who willingly undertook the office. End of chapter 81, part 8.